The morning Jennie Lockhart was supposed to become Mrs. Harold Fitch. The sky above Caldwell, Kansas turned the color of old brass, and every rooster in town fell silent before the sun had properly cleared the horizon, as though even the animals understood that something was about to go terribly, beautifully wrong. It was the spring of 1882, and Caldwell sat at the edge of everything, the edge of the cattle trails, the edge of the Indian Territory border, the edge of what people called civilization and what others called confinement. The town had grown fast and loud in the way that Kansas cattle towns always did, sprouting saloons and dry goods stores and a proper bank right alongside the dust and the cowboys, and the smell of longhorns that drifted up from the holding pens near the rail yards. Harold Fitch owned that bank. He was 38 years old, trim in a calculating way, with ink-stained fingers and silver watch chains, and a manner that made every transaction feel like something was being taken from you even when something was technically being given. Jennie was 24. She had copper-brown hair that she pinned up every morning with the 3 tortoiseshell combs her mother had left her, and eyes the shade of creek water in late October, not quite green, not quite gray, but something living somewhere between the two. She was the daughter of Thomas Lockhart, who had run the feed and grain store on the corner of Main and Chestnut until a bad drought year, and 2 unlucky loans had conspired to put him considerably in debt to the very institution Harold Fitch presided over. The wedding had been arranged the previous autumn in the kind of quiet desperation that masquerades as practicality. Thomas Lockhart had not sold his daughter, not exactly, but neither had he done much to prevent the arrangement from solidifying into something that felt, at least to Jennie, like a transaction in all but name. She stood in front of the small oval mirror in her childhood bedroom on the morning of the wedding, wearing a dress of ivory muslin that Mrs. Calloway from the seamstress shop had made on short notice. It was a respectable dress. It was a respectable life waiting for her on the other side of this morning. She told herself this while she pressed the last comb into her hair. She told herself this while she listened to her father's footsteps on the floorboards downstairs, heavier than usual, slower, the walk of a man carrying guilt he had dressed up as relief. "You look fine," her younger sister Clara said from the doorway. Clara was 19, practical as iron nails, and she had the decency to sound only moderately convincing. "I know," Jennie said. She looked at herself in the mirror for one more moment, then turned away. That was all. She turned away from the mirror and walked downstairs, and did not let herself think about the feeling in her chest that felt less like anticipation, and more like the moment before a door closes on a room you will never be allowed back into. The church in Caldwell was a white wooden building 2 streets over from the main road, and by 10 in the morning it was already packed with most of the town's respectable inhabitants. Harold Fitch's business associates occupied the pews on the left. The Lockhart family's friends and neighbors, somewhat fewer in number, occupied the pews on the right. The Reverend, a thin man named Foster who smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, stood at the front with the practiced serenity of someone who had seen enough weddings and enough funerals to treat them as variations on the same theme. Harold was already standing at the altar when Jennie arrived. He turned when he heard the doors open, and he looked at her the way he looked at a ledger entry that had finally been properly balanced. Satisfied. Certain. Already done with the business of wanting, because wanting was imprecise, and he preferred precision. Thomas Lockhart walked his daughter down the aisle with his arm through hers, and Jennie felt the trembling in his elbow, the fine vibration of a man who was ashamed and grateful at the same time, and she loved her father, and that love made everything harder and more real. She kept her eyes on the Reverend's face. She kept her chin level. She was going to do this because it was sensible, because it would save her father's store, because Harold Fitch was not a cruel man exactly, only a cold one, and there were worse things in this world than being cold. She was 3 steps from the altar when the back doors of the church opened. The sound hit before anything else did, the creak of hinges that needed oiling, the sudden rush of warm outside air, and then boots on the wooden floor. Not the careful measured steps of a late guest. Quick steps, deliberate steps, the steps of someone who had been riding hard and hadn't quite slowed down yet. Jennie did not turn around immediately. She felt every head in the church turn, heard the rustle of clothing and the intake of breath that ran through the pews like wind through tall grass. She felt her father's arm go rigid against hers. She heard Harold Fitch say, very quietly and very precisely, "What in the devil?" She turned around. He was standing in the open doorway of the church with the brass morning light behind him, which meant for a moment she could only see his silhouette, tall, broad across the shoulders, wearing a trail coat dark with dust and a hat that had seen considerable weather. Then he stepped inside, and the light caught him properly, and Jennie Lockhart's heart did something she had not given it permission to do. Clarence Keene was 27 years old, though he could look older when he was tired, and he was clearly tired now. He had a face that was honest in the way weathered things are honest, direct, unadorned, marked by sun and wind, and whatever it was that happened to a man when he spent years working cattle across the open country. His jaw was dark with several days' worth of stubble. His eyes were brown and clear, and fixed on Jennie with an expression that contained multitudes and was trying, unsuccessfully, to contain them quietly. He had worked for Thomas Lockhart 2 years ago. He had come through Caldwell on a cattle drive from Texas, taken a few weeks' work at the feed store during the off-season, slept in the back storeroom, eaten at the Lockhart table 3 times a week, and somewhere in the course of all that had looked at Jennie Lockhart across her father's kitchen table and understood something about himself that he hadn't known before. He had left because the cattle work called him, and he had nothing substantial to offer. He had sent 2 letters that Jennie had never received, because Thomas Lockhart, who had his own calculations running, had intercepted them and burned them in the kitchen stove with the same practical resignation with which he did most difficult things. He had spent the last 8 months in Texas working a big spread outside San Antonio, saving money, making a plan, telling himself he was being responsible and not simply afraid. He had ridden 340 miles in 6 days when a passing rider from Caldwell had mentioned, entirely without understanding the detonation the information would cause, that the Lockhart girl was marrying Harold Fitch the first Saturday in May. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours in the last 2 days. His horse was stabled at the edge of town, breathing hard into a water trough. He had ridden into Caldwell with mud on his boots and dust in every crease of his coat, and no plan beyond getting to this church before the words were said and something irreversible happened. The whole church was silent. Harold Fitch broke it first. "I don't know who you are," he said, his voice carrying that precise, contained quality that he used in negotiations, "but this is a private ceremony and I'll ask you to remove yourself." Clarence was not looking at Harold Fitch. He was looking at Jennie. "Jennie," he said, just that. Her name and the way he said it, like it was both an apology and an argument, like it had been building pressure inside him for the better part of a year and finally had somewhere to go. The feeling in Jennie's chest, the one she had been pressing down all morning, cracked open. "I sent letters," Clarence said. "I know you didn't get them, or I have to believe you didn't get them, because I said things in those letters that I should have said before I left, and I thought, it doesn't matter what I thought. I'm saying them now." He pulled his hat from his head with one hand, a gesture so automatic and respectful it was almost painful to watch. "I shouldn't have left without telling you. I was working up to something I didn't have the right to ask yet, and I left to earn that right, and I know I'm late. I know exactly how late I am, but I am asking you now, right here, in front of whoever you need me to ask in front of, to not do this." The silence in the church had moved from startled to something more charged. Someone coughed. A child near the back made a small sound that their mother hushed immediately. Thomas Lockhart's arm was no longer trembling. It had gone completely still, which was somehow worse. Harold Fitch's voice came out flat and sharp as cut metal. "Jennie, this is absurd. And here was the moment. Jennie could feel it the way you feel a river's current against your legs, the pull of it, the fact of it, the understanding that once you moved a certain direction it would have you. She could look forward, step to the altar, marry Harold Fitch, save her father's mortgage, live a careful and respectable life in a house that would always feel like someone else's furniture, or she could turn fully around. She turned fully around. "Where did you send the letters?" she asked Clarence. "Here," he said. "The store." "Addressed to you." She turned to her father. Thomas Lockhart's face had the look of a man standing at the bottom of something he had dug himself. "Papa," she said very quietly. "Jennie, did you receive letters for me from Clarence Keene?" The question fell into the church like a stone into still water, and the ripples spread immediately. Half the pews shifted. Someone whispered something to someone else. Thomas Lockhart's face crumpled at the edges, the way old wood does before it finally gives. "I was trying to protect you," he said. "From letters." It wasn't quite a question, and it wasn't quite a statement. It was the sound of something Jennie had suspected without knowing she suspected it, arriving as confirmation. "From uncertainty," her father said, and his voice had the true quality of a man who had genuinely believed what he was doing was right, which made it more complicated and more painful than if he had simply been selfish. "He was a drifter, Jennie, a trail hand. I didn't know if he'd amount to anything. I didn't know if he'd come back." "He came back," Jennie said. The church might have contained 50 people at that moment, but the only 3 that existed in that space were Jennie, her father, and Clarence Keene standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands. Harold Fitch existed as a pressure to her left, a fact she was aware of, a commitment she had made that now had to be addressed with honesty, which was the only way Jennie Lockhart knew how to address anything. She turned to Harold. She looked at him directly, and she saw on his face not heartbreak, because Harold Fitch did not operate in those registers, but something more like the particular affront of a man who has been made to look like a fool in public, which was in some ways worse and in other ways completely more manageable. "Harold," she said, "I am deeply sorry. I should not have let it come this far. I knew this morning and I didn't say it, and that was cowardly of me, and I am sorry for that." "Your father's debt," Harold began. "My father's debt is between you and my father," Jennie said, and her voice was steady. "It should never have had anything to do with me. And if you are a man of business, you already know that a marriage contracted under those circumstances would have made neither of us happy." Harold Fitch stood at his own altar for a moment, looking at Jennie with his silver watch chain and his ink-stained hands and the ledger expression on his face. Then something shifted in his eyes, not warmth. He wasn't built for warmth, but something like recognition. A balance that could not be made to work no matter how you arrange the figures. "Your father's note comes due in 60 days, Harold said. It was not a threat. It was simply a fact, delivered in the language of a man whose heart spoke in promissory notes. He picked up his hat from the pew where he had left it, nodded to the Reverend with the crisp efficiency of someone who had just concluded an unsuccessful meeting, and walked out the side door. The church remained in a state of suspended breath for another full 3 seconds. Then it erupted into the kind of noise that Caldwell's Gossip Mills would be processing for the better part of the next decade. Jennie walked back down the aisle toward Clarence Keene. Up close, he looked both better and worse than her memory of him had managed. Better because he was real and present in a way that memory never quite captured. Worse because he was exhausted in a bone-deep way, and there was something careful in his expression now that hadn't been there in the doorway, something that understood the weight of what he had just done to her public standing and her father's financial situation, and was bracing for the accounting. "You rode from Texas," she said. "San Antonio," he said. "Heard the news 6 days ago. You must have ridden very fast. I didn't see any particular reason to be slow about it." She looked at him. She could hear the church behind her settling into its noise, could feel Clara's presence somewhere to her left, could sense her father standing very still in the middle of the aisle like a man turned to wood by his own conscience. "You should have mailed better letters," Jennie said. "I should have stayed," Clarence said, and the simplicity of it, the clean acknowledgement without excuse, was more than any elaboration could have been. "You are late," she said. "Yes. I am standing in the middle of a church in my wedding dress with half the town watching. Yes. My father's debt is due in 60 days. I have money," Clarence said, "not a fortune. But I worked 8 months on the Caldwell Springs Ranch outside San Antonio, and I saved nearly all of it, and I have enough to clear a modest debt, and to start something decent if there's land to start it on. I was going to come back with a proper proposal. I didn't plan to propose in a church in front of 50 people as an alternative to someone else's wedding." "What were you planning to propose with?" He reached into the inside pocket of his trail coat, which was remarkable considering the state of the coat, and produced a small ring made of silver with a single pale stone that caught the church's window light. "I bought it in San Antonio," he said, "3 months ago. I've been carrying it since." Jennie looked at the ring. She looked at Clarence Keene. She thought about the feeling she had been pressing down all morning, and the way it had cracked open the moment she heard his voice, and the fact that she had spent the last year telling herself that practical was the same thing as right. "We are going to need to have a very long conversation," she said. "I know. Beginning with the letters and what you actually said in them. I'll tell you every word. And there is the matter of 60 days and my father's debt. I will speak to your father today." "You will need to speak to me first," Jennie said. "My father and Harold Fitch have been speaking for me long enough." Clarence looked at her, and something in his face that had been braced against rejection relaxed one careful degree. "That is fair," he said. "That is completely fair." Outside the church, the town of Caldwell continued its Saturday morning. The smithy rang on Commerce Street. 2 boys chased a dog past the dry goods store. The cattle pens at the edge of town held their usual population of longhorns destined for the rail cars north. The world was entirely indifferent to the fact that inside the white wooden church, Jennie Lockhart had just stepped off the edge of the life that had been arranged for her and was standing in free fall, looking at a tired, dusty cowboy with a silver ring, feeling more awake than she had in a year. She walked out of the church with Clarence Keene beside her, and the morning light caught them both. They went first to the small cafe at the end of Main Street, because Clarence clearly needed coffee and food, and because a cafe table was a more reasonable place to have the first real conversation of their acquaintance than either a church or a street corner. The cafe was run by a woman named Mrs. Adelman, who had the good grace to bring coffee and bread and ask no questions beyond whether they wanted eggs, which they both did. Jennie took off her white gloves and set them on the table beside her coffee cup, and looked at Clarence across the small table with its checkered cloth and its tin sugar jar. In the daylight of the cafe, he looked thoroughly human, tired and travel-worn and very real, with hay still caught in the cuff of his coat and a bruised scrape along his left jaw that she hadn't noticed in the church. "What happened to your face?" she asked. He touched the scrape with 2 fingers. "Horse put me down in a creek bed night before last. It was dark. My own fault." "You were riding at night. I was trying to get here." She poured coffee into both cups and wrapped her hands around hers. "The letters," she said. "Tell me what you said." He told her. It took a while. He was not a man who spoke in flowing sentences, but he was precise when he needed to be. And what he had written in those letters, first in October when he reached San Antonio, then in January after he had worked enough to believe in himself, was the careful and exact truth of what he had felt sitting at her father's kitchen table. Listening to her talk about the book she was reading, or the order that hadn't come in, or the way the sunset looked different over the Kansas flats than anywhere else she had seen, which at that point wasn't many places, but she had described it with enough attention that he had believed her completely. He had written that she was the most honest person he had met in 3 years on the trail, and he meant honest in the fullest sense, honest in her observations, honest in her disagreements, honest in what she wanted even when she was still working out what that was. He had written that he left without saying what he should have said because he was 26 years old and had no land and no savings and nothing but wages and a good horse, and it seemed wrong to ask anything of a woman like her from that position. He had written that he was going to change that and come back properly prepared. Jennie listened to all of this. She ate her eggs. She drank her coffee. She kept her expression even, not because she wasn't moved, but because being moved and being careful were not mutually exclusive. "And the ring?" she asked when he had finished. "January," he said. "I had enough saved by then to feel like a person with some prospect. I saw it in a jeweler's window and it was the right size. I just knew it was, and I bought it because I needed something concrete to carry. I needed to know I was actually going to do this and not just think about doing it." "You guessed my size. I remembered your hands," he said, and the simplicity of that stopped her somewhere deep. "I thought about you," she said finally, "after you left. I told myself not to, and I did it anyway, and when the letters stopped coming, when I never got any letters, I told myself I'd been foolish, that you were a trail hand who'd moved on. I understand why you thought that. My father was trying to protect me," she said, and she was still working out how she felt about that, which required the honesty she prided herself on. He was also trying to solve his own problem. Both things were true at once, which makes it complicated. "I am very angry with him, and I also love him, and those will both be true for some time. He should have let you make your own choices," Clarence said. "Yes," Jennie said, "he should have. And Harold Fitch should not have allowed a business arrangement to become a marriage arrangement, and I should have been stronger about saying no when I had the chance." She set down her coffee cup. "We have all of us been less than our best selves in this matter. I should have come back sooner," Clarence said. "Instead of sending letters, I kept telling myself I wasn't ready yet. I think I was afraid." "Of what?" "That you'd say no," he said, with the directness that she had always found both disarming and necessary. "That I'd come back and you'd look at me and think about what I was offering and say no, and I wouldn't be able to bear it as well as I told myself I could." "You came back anyway," Jennie said. 340 miles in 6 days. When I thought I was going to lose you entirely, I found out I preferred the chance of rejection to no chance at all." Jennie looked at him across the cafe table with the morning sounds of Caldwell coming through the window behind him. She thought about 60 days and her father's debt. She thought about the ring in his coat pocket. She thought about the fact that her wedding dress was going to need to be returned to Mrs. Calloway, and that conversation was not going to be simple. She thought about all the practical things, because that was her nature, and she set them aside one by one. "Tell me what you're proposing," she said. "Specifically. Not the feeling of it, I understand the feeling of it. Tell me the actual plan." He straightened slightly. "I have $420 saved. I know of land south of town, about 8 miles out, that Thomas Harker is looking to sell 60 acres with a creek and a standing cabin that needs work but is sound. I looked at it 2 years ago when I was here and I thought about it. I have a contact who can get me seasonal work with the McCready cattle operation east of here, while I build up the property, enough to cover expenses and grow the herd. I had a conversation with Jim Whitfield at the stockyards in San Antonio, and he's willing to let me bring 10 head up from his spare stock on credit against first season's earnings." He paused. "I am proposing a small start. I am not proposing comfort, not immediately, but I am proposing something that grows, and I am proposing to be present for it, and I am proposing—" He stopped. "Say it," Jennie said. "I am proposing a life with you, in whatever form and at whatever pace makes sense to you. I am not asking you to step into something finished. I am asking you to step into something we build." The morning light was warm through the cafe window. Mrs. Adelman was refilling coffee at the far end of the room and making a very dedicated effort not to listen, which meant she was listening intently. "You need to speak to my father about the debt," Jennie said. "I will. And then I need to speak to my father about my father." "That conversation is yours entirely," Clarence said. "I won't be in it unless you want me." "And then," Jennie said, "you are going to need to properly ask me. Right now." "Not right now. You need to sleep first." You look like something the cattle drove over." The corner of his mouth moved. It was the first thing that had approached a smile in the whole conversation, and it transformed his face, and Jennie felt the warmth of it land somewhere in her chest and stay there. "I can sleep," he said. She stood and put on her gloves. "There is a respectable boarding house on 2nd Street run by Mrs. Hartwell. Tell her Thomas Lockhart sent you and she will give you a fair rate." "You're sending me to the boarding house." "You just interrupted my wedding," Jennie said. "We are going to do the rest of this properly." He stood, which put him considerably above her, and for a moment they stood on opposite sides of the small cafe table with the checkered cloth between them, and he looked at her with those honest brown eyes and said, "Jennie, I am sorry for the years and the letters and the distance and being late. I am sorry for all of it." "I know," she said. "We will work it out." She picked up her coffee cup, drained the last of it, set it down. "Sleep first, then my father, then ask me." She walked out of the cafe and into the Caldwell morning, and the first thing that happened was that she ran almost directly into Clara, who had clearly been waiting approximately 6 feet from the cafe door and was making no attempt to pretend otherwise. "Well," Clara said. "Well, what?" Jennie said. "Don't do that to me, Jennie. I watched you walk out of your own wedding. Tell me something." "I walked out of Harold Fitch's arrangement," Jennie said. "I'm not sure I was fully in attendance emotionally to begin with." She started walking toward home. Clara fell into step beside her immediately. "He's very handsome," Clara said, "even covered in trail dust." "He is," Jennie agreed. "That is not why I walked out." "No, but it's a nice additional fact." They walked in silence for half a block. The town was going about its Saturday business around them, though more people than usual seemed to be finding reasons to be on the streets near the church, which Jennie noted without comment. "What's going to happen with Papa's debt?" Clara asked, because Clara was practical in the way that younger siblings sometimes are freed from the weight of responsibility. They can ask the practical questions directly. "Clarence has money and a plan," Jennie said. "I don't know the details of the debt well enough to know if it's enough. Papa is going to have to tell me the actual numbers." "Papa is currently sitting in the first pew of an empty church," Clara said. "I looked in through the window. He's just sitting there." "He needs to sit there for a while," Jennie said. "Let him." The conversation with her father happened late that afternoon, after Jennie had changed out of the muslin dress and hung it carefully on the hook behind her door, where it looked reproachful, and she let it look reproachful because she didn't have the energy to put it anywhere else. She found Thomas Lockhart in his kitchen, at the table where he had eaten breakfast for 20-some years, and built his life and his mistakes with equal industry. She sat across from him and asked him to tell her the actual number of the debt. He told her. It was more than she had thought, but not more than Clarence had said he could address combined with a payment arrangement. "He burned my letters," Jennie said, "not a question." "I didn't want you to hope for something uncertain," Thomas said. His voice was old in a way it hadn't sounded this morning. "You should have let me decide that for myself," Jennie said. "I am 24 years old, Papa. I am not a horse you can steer toward a better field." "I know," he said. "I was afraid you'd make the wrong choice." "Maybe I would have," Jennie said. "But it would have been my wrong choice, and that matters. Do you understand why that matters?" He was quiet for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, a wagon went past on the street. Thomas Lockhart looked at his hands on the table, large, work-worn hands, honest hands, the hands of a man who had worked hard his whole life and loved his daughters imperfectly in the way that people who are afraid usually love. "I understand," he said. He looked up. "Is he a good man, Jennie? Truly?" "I believe so," she said. "He came 340 miles in 6 days when he thought he was losing his chance. That tells me something significant about a person's character. And the debt. He says he can address most of it. He'll come to you tomorrow." Thomas nodded slowly. "I'll listen to what he has to say." "You'll do more than listen," Jennie said, with a firmness that made her father blink. "You'll tell him the truth, and you'll make a real arrangement, and you will not try to manage this the way you managed the letters." "No," Thomas said. "No, I won't." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He was 60 years old and his hair had gone completely white in the past 2 winters, and he was a man who had made a significant error out of love and something she could recognize as fear if she chose to be generous. And she was his daughter, and this was the world they inhabited together. "We are going to be all right," she told him. "But from here forward you have to trust me to make my own choices." "I know," he said, and this time he meant it completely. Clarence came to the Lockhart house the following morning, clean-shaved and rested, in his best shirt and a coat that had been brushed within an inch of its life. Jennie watched him from the upstairs window as he came up the front path, and there was something so straightforward about the way he walked, purposeful, no performance to it, no calculation, that it made her chest ache in a way she was beginning to recognize as important. He spent an hour with Thomas Lockhart in the front room, while Jennie and Clara sat in the kitchen, and Clara attempted to maintain a conversation about something unrelated and failed completely. When Clarence came into the kitchen doorway, he looked at Jennie first, which she noted, and then spoke to both of them. "We've come to an agreement," he said. $300 against the debt now and the remainder in payments by year's end, to be guaranteed by the property I intend to purchase. Your father has accepted the terms and we will go to the bank on Monday to make it proper with a paper agreement. Harold Fitch's bank, Jennie said, a slight wince. "Yes." "Well," Jennie said, "that will be an interesting meeting." "I've handled more uncomfortable conversations," Clarence said. "I'm sure you have." Clara stood up with the deliberateness of someone who has decided to be tactful. "I am going to go see about the garden," she announced, to no one in particular, and was out the back door in approximately 10 seconds. Jennie looked at Clarence in the kitchen doorway. "You wanted to ask me something," she said. He came into the kitchen and she realized the ring was already in his hand, not pulled out dramatically but simply held. There it was, the small silver ring with the pale stone, in his palm like something he'd been carrying so long he'd stopped noticing the weight of it. "I know this is fast," he said. "I know you might want time. I'm not asking you to decide today on a wedding date. I am asking you to decide today whether you'd consider the possibility of one." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not Harold Fitch. I can't offer you a house in town and certainty and stability already built. I'm offering 60 acres and a cabin and 8 months of savings and a cattle plan that I believe in, and the fact that when I found out I might lose the chance to be with you, I rode across 3 states without much sleep to try to stop it." "Kansas and Texas," Jennie said. "That's 2 states. Oklahoma Territory in between," he said. 3 was close enough. She came around the kitchen table, which was smaller than the cafe table, and put them very close together, and she looked at the ring and then at him. "Clarence Keene," she said, "you are late. Your coat was a disaster yesterday. You sent letters to the wrong address." "Your father's address," he said. "Which was the right address? And you propose with a ring you bought 3 months ago on a hope." "The best I had," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She looked at him for one more moment and then she held out her left hand. He put the ring on her finger. It fit perfectly, as he had somehow known it would, and the pale stone caught the kitchen window light and held it. They stood in her father's kitchen in the morning quiet, and he took her hand in both of his, and she looked at the ring on her finger and understood that she had just made a real choice, her own, unmanaged, fully felt, and it was the most awake she had been in years. "We are going to need to be sensible about this," she said. "Entirely," he agreed. "I want to see the cabin before we commit to a wedding date. We can ride out there today if you want. I have boots that will hold up to that. You know better than me what's in your own wardrobe." She laughed, and the laugh surprised her, came out freely and fully, and she felt him look at her when it happened, with an expression that she could only describe as the look of a man who had decided something was worth everything and has just had the decision confirmed. They rode out to the Harker property that afternoon. Clarence borrowed a second horse from the livery, a steady roan mare, and they went south on the flat Kansas road, with the plains spreading out around them in that particular spring green that the territory produced only for about 3 weeks before the summer heat turned it brown. The sky was wide and cloudless and enormous in the way Kansas skies are, which is to say in a way that makes you feel both very small and very free. And Jennie rode beside Clarence, and they talked more easily than they had in the charged interior spaces of the church and the cafe and the kitchen. She found out that he had grown up in Missouri, the third of 4 boys, that his father had been a farmer who died when Clarence was 16, and his mother had moved in with her sister in St. Louis, and that Clarence had gone west at 17 with a cattle outfit, and had been moving in cattle time ever since trailing herds up from Texas on the Kishom Trail, working winter spreads in New Mexico, learning the geography of the open country in the detailed way that men learn things they love. She told him about the books she kept under her bed, the ones that were too worn for the shelf, and about the garden she had planted every spring since she was 12, and about the time she had ridden all the way to Wichita by herself to visit a school friend and her father hadn't known until she was already home safe. "Were you always like that?" Clarence asked. "Like what?" "Like you're going to do the thing regardless of whether anyone thinks it's a good idea." Jennie considered this. "I think I got quieter about it for a few years," she said. "When the store got into trouble, I thought being practical meant giving up some of that." She paused. "I think I was wrong about that." The Harker property came into view in the late afternoon, a stretch of flat and gently rolling land with a thread of cottonwoods marking the creek, and the cabin sitting squarely in the middle of a natural clearing. It was small. It was honestly in need of work. The front step was rotted through, the chimney wanted repointing, and one of the windows had been replaced with oiled cloth. But the walls were true, and the roof was intact, and the structure was solid in the way that someone had built it to last. They dismounted and walked around it, and she looked at it with a practical eye, and he watched her look at it. "The step can be replaced in a day," she said. "The chimney is an autumn job. The window needs glass, which the hardware store in town carries." She walked to the creek and looked at it, clean running water, cold from underground. She turned back to the cabin. "It has good bones," she said. "That's what I thought. The land is flat enough for a kitchen garden on the south side." She shaded her eyes to look south. "Decent sun exposure. I thought you'd notice that." She turned to face him, and the late afternoon light was on both of them, warm and extended in the way of spring evenings on the plains. And he was standing with his hat in his hand again, that same gesture from the church that she already associated with him being completely sincere. "I want to marry you," she said. "I want to be clear about that, but I also want to be certain we are doing this as partners, not me coming into your plan as an addition." "Jennie," he said, "I have been making plans for a year, and they have all had you in the middle of them. You are not an addition." She nodded, satisfied. She looked at the cabin once more. "6 weeks," she said. "Give me 6 weeks to do what needs doing. For the wedding, for the cabin and the wedding and everything else. 6 weeks is enough time to do this right." He smiled then, a full smile, not the controlled half measure from the cafe, and it was something she decided she wanted to see as often as possible for the rest of her life. The next 6 weeks were the busiest and most purposeful of Jennie Lockhart's life. Clarence purchased the Harker property from old Samuel Harker himself, a transaction that took place over 3 cups of very strong coffee, and resulted in a deed that Jennie read carefully before it was signed, which caused Harker to give her a long look and then nod with evident respect. Clarence made his arrangement with Harold Fitch's bank on the Monday as planned. The meeting was, as predicted, uncomfortable, and Harold Fitch conducted it with exact professional courtesy and nothing additional, which was frankly the best possible outcome, and Jennie was grateful for it. The cabin repair became a community enterprise almost without intention. Jim Whitfield from next door, an older homesteader who had been watching the Harker property sit empty for 2 years, appeared the first Saturday with tools and an opinion about the chimney. Thomas Lockhart came out the following week with lumber for the step, and spent an afternoon working alongside Clarence with the careful, deliberate energy of a man trying to make amends in the language of physical work, which was the most natural language he had. The two men did not have a direct conversation about the letters or the wedding or the whole complicated year of it, but they worked well together, and by the end of the afternoon, they had drunk water from the same bucket, and that was something. Clara came out twice with food and planted the kitchen garden on the south side on a warm April morning, while Jennie was repointing the chimney from the ladder and Clarence was fitting the new window glass. They worked in companionable coordination, calling measurements and requests back and forth, and at one point Clara put down her trowel and watched them for a moment and said, to no one in particular, that it was very gratifying when things worked out. Jennie ordered muslin and cotton from the dry goods store and made herself a new dress, not white, she had decided, but a blue the color of creek water in October, the color of her own eyes. She made it herself, because she was capable of it, and because there was something important about that. The wedding was set for a Saturday in June. The Reverend Foster, who had been present for the first attempt and now found himself presiding over the second, accepted the commission with the particular equanimity of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by the directions people's lives took. In the weeks between the engagement and the wedding, Jennie and Clarence spent considerable time together in the practical business of establishing a life, ordering stock from Whitfield's connection at the cattle yard, building the fence line for the pasture, deciding where the vegetable garden would expand in the second year, arguing in a productive way about whether the barn should be built this fall or next spring. They argued with the ease of people who have discovered that they disagree well, which is rarer and more valuable than simply agreeing. They also spent time simply being in each other's company, evening walks along the creek when the day's work was done, sitting on the repaired porch step watching the wide Kansas sky go through its evening colors, talking about books she had read and trail drives he remembered, and the 100 small things that make up the texture of a person's life. One evening about 3 weeks before the wedding, sitting on the porch in the last light, Clarence said, "I want to ask you something that I should have thought to ask before." "Then ask. Do you want to stay in Caldwell? I assumed the property made sense because it's near your family and a town you know, but if you wanted somewhere else." "I want to be here," Jennie said without hesitation. "I want to be near Clara and my father, and I want to watch this place grow from what it is into what it can be. I don't need to go elsewhere to have a full life." She paused, "but the fact that you asked matters to me considerably. I should have asked before." "You ask things when you think of them," she said. "So do I. Will get better at asking earlier." He took her hand, which he had started doing more readily in recent weeks, as though the ring on her finger had settled something in him that he hadn't known was unsettled. They sat in the last of the evening light with the creek running nearby and the cottonwoods moving in the warm breeze and the plains stretching away in every direction, and Jennie felt the rightness of it with the full weight of a feeling that doesn't need to justify itself. "I missed you," she said. "I want you to know that. Even when I was telling myself I'd been foolish to think about you, I missed you. That whole year." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry for the lost year." "Don't be sorry any more than you already are," she said. "We're here now." He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture so old-fashioned and genuine it made her breath catch. "Here now," he agreed. The wedding of Jennie Lockhart and Clarence Keene took place on a Saturday in the middle of June 1882, in the same white church on the same street, with the same Reverend Foster presiding. The church was full again, but the atmosphere was entirely different, not the held breath of an obligation being observed, but the warm, active noise of people genuinely pleased to be present for something. Jennie wore the blue dress she had made herself. She carried a small bunch of prairie flowers that Clara had gathered that morning. She walked down the aisle on her father's arm again, and this time Thomas Lockhart's elbow was steady, and when she looked at his face, she saw that he was not ashamed and relieved in equal measure, but simply proud, properly proud, cleanly proud, the pride of a man who has done one right thing in making amends for another wrong one. Clarence was waiting at the altar, and he had made considerable effort. New shirt, a borrowed coat that fit him well, his hair combed straight, the trail dust entirely absent for once. He watched her come down the aisle with an expression that was private and public at the same time, the expression of a man who is feeling something enormous and is not trying to hide it. Reverend Foster kept the ceremony sensible in length, which Jennie had specifically requested. When he asked whether anyone had cause to object, there was a brief moment in which the entire church seemed to hold its breath for exactly the reason you'd expect, and then Clara let out a single very short laugh, which broke the tension entirely and drew laughter from half the pews. "I do," Jennie said when the moment came. "I do," Clarence said, and the way he said it contained the letters and the distance and the 340 miles and 6 days and everything else, all folded into 2 words with a directness that was simply and completely him. The Reverend pronounced them married, and Clarence took her face in both hands, those large, careful, work-worn hands, and kissed her in the manner of someone who has waited long enough and intends to make the waiting count. And the church made the particular sound that churches make when the thing being witnessed is exactly what it should be. They went back to the cabin that evening, which was by then clean and fixed and furnished in the modest way that 2 practical people furnish a home, what was necessary, what was useful, with spaces left deliberately for what would come later. The lamp on the table threw warm light across the walls. The kitchen garden was already showing green through the south window. The creek ran past in the darkness outside, constant and unhurried. Jennie sat on the edge of the bed and took out the 3 tortoiseshell combs one by one and set them on the washstand, and Clarence sat beside her, and she turned to look at him in the lamplight and said, "Hello, husband." The pleasure and warmth that moved across his face at that particular word made the whole long year worth its entire weight. "Hello, wife," he said, and they were both quiet for a moment in the particular way of people who have arrived somewhere they didn't expect to arrive and have not yet finished understanding that they are really here. The first months of their marriage were hard in the practical sense and rich in every other. The cattle Clarence had arranged through Jim Whitfield arrived in August, 10 head of decent stock, not the best but healthy, and Clarence worked them alongside Jim's operation, while Jennie ran the household accounts with the same precision she had once applied to her father's store, keeping a careful ledger that tracked every expenditure and every earning, and made the picture of their finances clear and accurate at all times. She had, it turned out, an instinct for numbers that she had never had occasion to use fully before, and discovering it in the context of something that was entirely hers gave her a quiet satisfaction that she mentioned to Clarence and he immediately recognized. "You should be handling everything financial," he said, looking at her ledger with open admiration. "I am," she said. "I meant from here on not just catching up." "I know what you meant," she said, "and yes." They had their disagreements about whether to take a risky purchase of additional land that came up in September. Jennie said wait. She was right. About whether Clarence should take extra work with the McCready operation that fall that would take him away for 3 weeks. Jennie said yes. She was right about that too, and she missed him in a way that was different from the missing she'd done the year before because this missing had an end point and they both knew it. They had their silences, which were mostly comfortable and occasionally weren't, and they learned each other in the incremental way of people who are serious about the enterprise of knowing. The winter was a Kansas winter, which is to say it was serious. The first snow came in November and settled in for the duration, and the cabin's solidity proved itself. The repaired chimney drew beautifully, the walls kept the cold outside, and the 2 of them spent December evenings with the wood stove going strong and Jennie reading aloud from the books she kept by the lamp, while Clarence worked on leather repairs or sat doing the pleasant nothing of a man fully at rest. He was not a reader by nature, but he listened well, and they discovered that books are better with someone to discuss them with afterward. One December evening, with the snow coming down hard outside and the lamp throwing its amber circle, Jennie closed her book and looked at Clarence and said, "I want to tell you something." He looked up from the bridle he was mending. "I believe I am expecting," she said. The bridle went very still in his hands. He looked at her for a long moment, and his expression moved through several things before settling on a kind of open, undisguised joy that was one of the most unguarded things she had ever seen on a human face. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Fairly," she said. "I'll know more in a few more weeks." He set the bridle down on the floor, which was the first time she had ever seen him set work down mid-task, and he crossed the room and sat beside her on the bench and took both her hands in his. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Right now, this moment, how are you?" "Surprised," she said. "And not surprised, and rather pleased, I think." "Only rather pleased," he said, and the warmth in his voice made her laugh. "Very pleased," she said. "Thoroughly pleased, also slightly terrified." "I'm terrified too," he said. "That seems right." "We are going to need to expand the cabin," she said. "Spring," he said. "Spring," she agreed. He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they sat together in the warm circle of the lamp, while the winter came down outside. And Jennie thought about the morning of her wedding to Harold Fitch, and the feeling she had been pressing down, and how far she had come from that morning in the space of less than a year. And the measure of the distance was something she could only fully appreciate from here. The winter passed, and the spring came around again in 1883. And with it, the expansion of the cabin. Clarence added a room on the back side with help from Thomas Lockhart and Jim Whitfield, the three men now working together with the comfortable ease of a habit that had grown into itself. And the room was finished by the time it became genuinely necessary, which was the first week of May. The baby was born in the early morning of a May day that was clear and warm, with the cottonwoods fully leafed along the creek, and the kitchen garden coming in green on the south side. Clara had come out 2 days before and stayed, which was good because she had a practical calm about the whole event that was invaluable, and Mrs. Henderson from town, who served as the local midwife, arrived in time and knew exactly what she was doing. Clarence spent the hours of labor in the front room, which was approximately 40 years off his life, and when Clara finally opened the bedroom door and said he could come in, he went through that door so fast he nearly took it off its hinges. Jennie was sitting up against the headboard with her hair loose around her shoulders, and a face that was exhausted and lit up from the inside simultaneously, and in her arms was a baby boy, small and red-faced and unquestionably present in the emphatic way of new people. "Come here," Jennie said. Clarence sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and then at his wife, and he put out one careful finger that the baby immediately grabbed with a grip that surprised everyone, including the baby. "He is very strong," Clarence said. "He is," Jennie agreed. "We are going to call him Thomas," she said, "if you have no objection." Clarence looked up at her. "For your father?" "Yes," she said. "My father has been trying to be better. This would mean a great deal to him." She paused, "and it seems right to tie forward and back together." "Thomas Keene," Clarence said. He looked at the baby again. "Hello, Thomas." The baby made a noise that could charitably be interpreted as acknowledgement. They told Thomas Lockhart that afternoon. He came out to the cabin and he held his grandson with the precise, careful attention of a man who has been given a second chance and knows it. And when he looked up at Jennie, his eyes were wet and he didn't try to hide it. "Thank you," he said. "Both of you." "He has your chin," Jennie told him, which was true enough and caused her father to look at the baby with a new and particular attention. Clara held him and made the particular sounds that Clara made around anything young and helpless, and the afternoon settled into a warm domestic richness that Jennie absorbed with every part of herself. That evening, when the visitors had gone, and Thomas was asleep in the new room's small cradle that Clarence had built over the winter from good walnut wood, Jennie sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, while Clarence sat across from her, looking like a man who has been through something enormous and is still arriving on the other side of it. "You are all right?" he asked. "I am very all right," she said. "Tired to my bones, but all right." She smiled at him. "You were terrified today." "From the moment it started until the moment I saw you both," he said. Then terrified gave way to something else entirely. What was it? He thought about this. He was always careful with his answers, which was one of the things she prized about him. "Like the plains," he said finally. "Like standing on the plains when the sky is very big and the light is right. The feeling of being somewhere real." She wrapped her hands around her teacup and looked at him in the kitchen light. "Clarence." "Yes. Do you remember what you said in the church when you first walked in?" "Every word," he said. "I think about it sometimes," she said. "The fact that you actually came." She shook her head slowly. "I was going to do it. I was going to marry him. I had convinced myself it was the sensible thing." "I know," he said. "I don't think I was ever actually going to be all right," she said. "I think I was going to be quiet about it for so long that I forgot what all right was supposed to feel like. And then you walked in." "Late," he said. "You were late," she confirmed. "But you came." She looked at him with full, steady attention. "I chose late, Clarence. I want you to know that. Not because I had to, because late was you." He reached across the kitchen table and covered her hand with his. Outside, the May evening stretched over the Kansas plains in the long blue light that comes before full dark, the kind of light that makes everything look like it's been painted with the careful attention of someone who loves the thing they are depicting. The creek ran its easy sound. The horses moved in the pasture. Inside the new back room, Thomas Keene slept in his walnut cradle with his whole enormous future ahead of him. The years that followed built on this foundation, with the steady accumulative logic of a well-laid wall. The cattle operation grew. By 1884, they had 30 head and a working arrangement with the McCready operation that had become a genuine partnership rather than occasional hire. The cabin had become a proper house in stages. A second room, then a covered porch that wrapped around the south side, then a larger kitchen addition that Jennie designed herself with the insistence that it have adequate light and a proper pantry, because whoever cooked deserved to cook well. The land grew productive under their management in the way land does when worked by people who pay it respect. The kitchen garden expanded into a proper vegetable plot, then into a small orchard of apple and pear trees that would not bear fruit for years but was planted anyway, because a person who plants an orchard is making a claim about the future that Jennie found both practical and beautiful. Thomas Lockhart's debt was fully retired by the end of 1883, settled in full, and Harold Fitch conducted the final transaction with the same professional courtesy as all the others, and the matter was closed in every legal sense. In a private sense, it took Jennie slightly longer, not because she bore Harold Fitch any particular ill will, but because the careful examination of how she had allowed an arrangement not of her choosing to progress as far as it had was the kind of self-knowledge that has to be earned rather than declared. She earned it slowly and kept it. Harold Fitch, as it turned out, married a woman from Wichita the following year, a widow named Mrs. Carmichael, who had her own considerable means, and who looked at Harold across a business meeting with an expression that suggested she found his precise manner of conducting transactions rather attractive, which was a remarkable alignment of natures, and Jennie wished them well with complete sincerity. Thomas Lockhart's store recovered. The drought years gave way to better seasons. The plains were generous when the rain came right, and Thomas ran his business with a chastened and more honest care that his customers responded to. He came out to the Keene property most Sundays for dinner, and he and Clarence had developed, over the course of years, a genuine working friendship built on shared labor and mutual respect, and the tacit understanding of two men who both loved the same woman and both had, in different ways and at different times, let her down and were both determined not to do it again. Clara married in 1884. A schoolteacher named Robert Finch who had come to Caldwell as part of the new push to build proper schools across the Kansas territory, which was a part of the larger shift Jennie observed in the world around her. The trail drives were already changing as the railheads expanded further south, the wide open cattle runs contracting as the wire fences went up. The territory filling in with settlers and farms, and the complicated reality of a frontier becoming something more settled. The Kishom Trail that had brought cattle and cowboys through Caldwell for a decade was already waning by the mid-'80s, and Clarence watched it go with the complicated feelings of a man who had loved that life and loved this one more. He talked about it sometimes in the evenings, the way the trail had looked at 4 in the morning when the stars were still out, and the herd was moving quiet, and the whole world was open grass and sky. He talked about it without grief exactly, more with the affection you hold for something that prepared you for something better. "Do you miss it?" Jennie asked him one autumn evening in 1884. "Sometimes I miss the particular quality of it," he said. The bigness, the way nothing felt permanent. He looked out at their property, which was in its autumn beauty, the cottonwoods gone yellow along the creek, the grass brown and golden, the cattle moving in the late light. "But I had the bigness," he said. "Now I have this. I take this over any number of open trails." She leaned against him on the porch, and they watched the light go off the plains together. The second child came in 1885, a girl this time, which delighted Thomas the elder in the particular way that small girls delight older brothers, and they named her June for the month she arrived in, and she had Clarence's brown eyes and Jennie's copper hair, and a personality that announced itself with considerable force from approximately her first week of existence. June Keene was not a quiet child. She had opinions about everything and conveyed them clearly and without apology, and watching her develop, Jennie recognized something familiar and found it deeply satisfying. "She's going to run the county by the time she's 40, Clarence said once, watching June explain to 4-year-old Thomas why his plan for the afternoon was inferior to hers. "Earlier than that," Jennie said. In 1886, the second expansion of the house was completed, and the property by then had the look and feel of something established. The orchard trees still young but leafing properly, the house solid and whitewashed, the barn well built and maintained, the cattle operation running with the quiet competence of something that had been thought about carefully from the beginning. Neighbors knew the Keene place as well run and the Keenes as reliable, which in a farming and ranching community was a form of honor that mattered more than most. Jim Whitfield, who had been a neighbor and a friend since the beginning, suffered a bad fall from his roof in the fall of 1886 and spent the winter largely incapacitated. Clarence and Jennie managed his stock through the cold months without being asked and without calculation, simply because that was what a neighbor did. And when Jim was back on his feet in the spring, he tried to pay them, and Clarence refused with the particular firmness that was characteristic of him when he had made up his mind. "You helped us get started," Clarence told him. "This is the interest." Jim looked at him for a long moment and then said, "You're all right, Keene, you're all right." "My wife is all right," Clarence said. "I do my best to keep up." Jennie, who was standing near enough to hear this, looked across the yard at her husband with a warmth that had not diminished in 4 years of marriage, but had deepened into something more layered than warmth, a fundamental rightness, the feeling of a person who has found their right place in the world and knows it. The territory was changing all around them in those years. The cattle drives were nearly done by the late 80s. The rail lines had pushed south and west, and the open-range era was giving way to the fenced-in, settled, agricultural Kansas that would define the next century. The Kishom Trail, which had been the artery of the whole great cattle enterprise, was essentially finished as a working institution by 1885, and the cowboys who had ridden it were becoming ranchers or farmers or drifting toward the remaining open ranges further west. There was something elegiac about this transformation that Clarence acknowledged quietly and without self-pity. He had been part of something that was real and enormous and was now passing, and being part of it had made him the person who was here now, and here now was good. He took Thomas out riding regularly once the boy was old enough, teaching him the land from horseback the way land should be learned. The drainage patterns, the quality of different grasses, the way weather moved across the plains and what the clouds meant and what the wind said. Thomas Keene at 6 and 7 and 8 was becoming a person of distinct character, thoughtful, observant, slow to speak but accurate when he did, with his grandfather's large hands and his father's steady eyes, and something in him that was entirely his own. June remained herself vivid, determined, asking questions at a rate that required two parents operating simultaneously, filling the house with a vitality that was both exhausting and completely wonderful. She decided at age 5 that she was going to be a doctor, which Jennie told her was entirely possible, and Clarence confirmed without qualification, which Clara's husband Robert found admirable and several of their less modern-minded neighbors found remarkable. But Jennie had no patience for the idea that June's ambitions should be constrained by anyone else's small imagination. One afternoon in the late summer of 1887, Jennie was in the kitchen garden doing the end-of-season work, clearing the spent vines, turning the soil for next year, when she heard Clarence come across the yard from the barn, and she straightened up and looked at him and saw immediately that something was on his mind. "What is it?" she asked. He came and stood at the edge of the garden with his hat in his hand. There it was again, that gesture. After 5 years it still meant the same thing, complete sincerity fully offered. "I was thinking about the church," he said. "The first time." She looked at him, waiting. "I think about it sometimes," he said. "Walking in there and seeing you standing at the end of that aisle and not knowing, I didn't know what you were going to do. I didn't know if you'd turn around or keep walking." "I turned around," she said. "You did," he said. "Why?" She pulled off her gardening glove and stood in the late summer light of her own garden and thought about it properly, because it deserved a proper answer. "Because the moment I heard your voice I knew," she said. "I had been telling myself for a year that what I felt for you was impractical, that I'd built something in my imagination that wasn't real. And then I heard your voice and knew immediately that I hadn't built anything. It was real, and it had been real, and I had spent a year trying to talk myself out of something true." She looked at him directly. "I turned around because I finally trusted myself." He was quiet for a moment. "I am very glad you trusted yourself," he said. "So am I," she said. He crossed the garden to her, stepping carefully between the rows, and kissed her in the warm end-of-summer afternoon with the particular certainty of a man who has been given something he intends to honor for the rest of his life. And she kissed him back with the full and unambiguous intention of a woman who chose what she has and knows the weight of that choice. The third child came in 1888, another boy, whom they named William after Clarence's father, and who arrived with the minimum of drama and the maximum of health. An easy baby who slept well and observed the world with a round-eyed calm that made his older siblings regard him with suspicion for the first several weeks. The house by 1888 was a real home in every sense, warm and worn in, and full of the accumulated details of people who live fully. Books stacked on shelves next to tools and spare horseshoe nails. Children's drawings pinned to the kitchen wall beside Jennie's carefully kept account ledgers. The smell of coffee and bread and leather, and the outside coming in through whatever window was open. Jennie's 3 tortoiseshell combs sat on the washstand every morning and went into her hair every day, the one consistent thread of continuity from the life she had had before and the life she was living now. Thomas Lockhart had a health scare in the winter of 1888, a chest illness that confined him to bed for 3 weeks and frightened everyone. He came out of it thinner and less certain of his permanence, which had the effect of making him more present when he was present, more attentive to the specific moments of the Sunday dinners and the visits and the grandchildren crawling on his knee. He told Jennie one afternoon, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, that he was sorry again, not for the letters specifically, they had been through that, but for the more general pattern of making decisions for people he loved rather than trusting them. "Papa," Jennie said, "I know. I want you to know it's not lost on me," he said. "What this looks like, your life here. What does it look like?" "Real," he said. "It looks real and right and exactly what it should look like." And He stopped. "But you didn't," Jennie said. "He came back. We found each other." She put her hand over his on the table. "Everything that happened made us careful about getting it right. I'm not sure I would have known what I had if it hadn't been difficult to get to." Her father looked at her, and the love on his face was the clean kind, the kind that doesn't need anything back. Clarence came into the kitchen in time to hear the last part of this, and set a hand on Jennie's shoulder as he passed to get coffee, a gesture that said everything it needed to in the language of people who have learned each other thoroughly. Thomas Lockhart watched this with an expression of a man thoroughly and finally at peace with himself. The late 1880s brought news of the world to Caldwell through the newspaper that came in on the train, and the conversations at the dry goods store and the stockyards. The Oklahoma land run of 1889 brought tremendous noise and excitement to the territory just south of the Kansas border, and Clarence and Jennie watched the rush with the interest of people who had already made their land claim and were watching others make theirs. The frontier was filling in, the wildness was becoming measured and mapped, and the country that Clarence had crossed on horseback in his youth was becoming something organized and permanent. There was loss in this. Clarence named it honestly, which Jennie appreciated. There was also progress in its schools being built, like the one Robert Finch taught in, roads being maintained, the law arriving in places it had previously been abstract. The injustices were not resolved by settlement. The displacement of the nations from their territories, the violence that had preceded the maps, was a reality that the newspaper reported and the town discussed, and that Jennie read about with the troubled attention of someone who understood that a history being covered over was not a history being addressed. She talked to her children about this as they grew, because she believed that living well in a place required knowing what that place was made of. June, at 5 years old, asked her father once why the land that had been Cherokee and Osage territory was now Kansas, and Clarence answered her honestly because he was honest, and the answer was not comfortable, but it was true, and Jennie listened from the doorway with the feeling that they were doing right by their children even when the doing was difficult. The century's end approached with the Keene property well established and still growing. By 1889, they had 60 head of cattle and a reputation for quality stock that brought buyers from as far as Wichita. The orchard was bearing fruit. The first apple harvest in 1888 had produced enough for cider and preserves and several pies, and Jennie's satisfaction at eating an apple from a tree she had planted 5 years ago, in an act of deliberate faith in the future, was one of the deeper satisfactions of her adult life. In the evenings of those years, after the children were in bed and the house had settled into its night quiet, Jennie and Clarence sat together in the comfortable way of people who have made a real life, not every evening in high romance, because that is not the honest texture of a long marriage, but in the steady warmth of people who choose each other every day in the small ways that add up to everything. He still took off his hat when he was being completely sincere. She still noticed it every time. She was still the one who ran the accounts and made the financial decisions, a fact she took quiet pride in, not because it was remarkable but because it was right. She was good at it, and it served them, and that was all the justification needed. She had also, over the years, become a reference point for other women in the area who were managing household finances or dealing with the arithmetic of farm life, which she helped with directly and without condescension, the way you help someone with something you know well. One evening in the summer of 1889, with the 3 children asleep and the night warm enough to sit on the porch without a shawl, Jennie and Clarence sat side by side watching the stars come out over the plains. The sky was doing its enormous Kansas thing, stars appearing in their millions as the dark deepened, the Milky Way spreading its extravagant sweep overhead. "Do you remember what it was like," Jennie said, "before all of this was built?" "The Harker place," he said. "The rotted step in the oiled cloth window. We sat on the porch that first afternoon and I said it had good bones. I said that's what I thought," he said. She looked at the sky. "I was terrified," she said. "I didn't show it, but I was." "You seemed very certain," he said. I was certain and terrified at the same time, she said. They are not mutually exclusive. No, he said, they're not. He paused. I was terrified every day for the first year. Terrified I'd do something that proved I wasn't capable of this. Terrified you'd figure out I didn't always know what I was doing. I knew, she said. Oh, I knew, and I thought it was rather endearing, she said. And also that neither of us had to know everything as long as we were figuring it out together. He was quiet for a moment. That is a more generous way of looking at it than I was managing. I have always been more generous about your failings than you are, she said. You have been more patient with mine than I deserve. We have balanced out. He reached over and found her hand in the dark and held it, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat under the Kansas stars with the easy completeness of people who have arrived somewhere real and built something lasting and know it. In 1890, Thomas Keene was 8 years old and already helping with the cattle work in earnest, carrying his grandfather's name and his father's steadiness, and proving himself in daily small ways that Jennie noted with the particular attention she gave to all 3 of her children. June was 5 and had not abandoned her intention to be a doctor, and given the school Robert Finch was running and the books Jennie was putting in front of her, she had a reasonable foundation being built for an extraordinary ambition. William was 2 and had recently discovered that the most interesting place in any room was the highest point he could reach, which had necessitated some rearrangement of the house. Clarence turned 35 that year. Jennie gave him a new saddle, the best she could order from the saddler in Wichita, made properly, the kind that would last the rest of his working life. He looked at it for a long moment when she brought it out, then looked at her. "This is too much," he said. "It's exactly right," she said. He ran his hands over the leather. "Jennie, you've been using a patched saddle for 3 years," she said. "You deserve a good one." He looked at her with those clear, honest eyes and said, "I'm not talking about the saddle." She understood him exactly. "I know," she said. "Neither am I." They were 35 and 32 years old respectively, standing in the yard of their property in the warm autumn light with their 3 children and 60 head of cattle, and a working orchard, and a house with good bones well built upon, and the whole rest of their lives ahead of them. The years kept coming after that in the good way, not without difficulty, because difficulty is the price of being alive and fully invested in things, but with the accumulating richness of people who have built well and continue to build. There were dry summers and hard winters, and the usual agricultural anxieties of Kansas farm life. But there was also the first time Thomas rode a drive independently and came back proud and tired, and 2 inches taller in his own estimation. There was the spring that the orchard was particularly fine, and they sold apples in town for the first time, and June kept the account of that transaction in her own small notebook. There was the winter that William decided his vocation was horses, not cattle, and began the methodical study of every horse on the property that would define him for the rest of his childhood and long past it. Thomas Lockhart lived to see the turn of the next decade, healthier than his winter scare had suggested he'd be, spending his Sundays at the Keene table with the comfort of a man who knows his family well and is known by them. Clara and Robert Finch had 3 children of their own and lived in town, and the extended family gathered with a regularity that made occasions of ordinary days. On the last day of the year 1890, with the decade closing out and the new one beginning, Jennie sat in her kitchen with the house quiet around her. Clarence had taken the children to the evening gathering in town, and she had stayed behind on the pretext of baking and in the truth of wanting an hour alone with the year that was closing. She thought about the morning of May 1882 and the church and the brass-colored sky and the silent roosters and the feeling of walking toward an altar that did not belong to her future. She thought about the sound of the church doors opening. She thought about the boots on the wooden floor. She thought about turning around. She was grateful, in the full and complicated way of someone who has lived through enough to understand that gratitude is not simple, but is among the most important things. She was grateful for the choice she made, and for the man who made himself worth choosing, and for the 60 acres with the creek and the cottonwoods and the house with good bones, and for Thomas and June and William, asleep in their beds most nights and raising entirely excellent amounts of noise the rest of the time, and for Clara and her father, and even for the long, hard year that had preceded all of this, because it was the crucible in which the clear understanding of what she wanted had been arrived at. She was grateful for being late, for choosing late, for Clarence Keene, who rode 340 miles in 6 days to stand in a church doorway with his hat in his hands and her name in his mouth like something held very carefully. When the wagon came back up the road an hour later, and she heard the children's voices and then Clarence's boots on the porch step, she was still in the kitchen with the lamp going and the smell of bread in the air. He came in and looked at her across the kitchen with that face she knew as well as her own now, all its variations and weathers, and she smiled at him. "Good evening," she asked. "Better now," he said. She stood up from the table. He was still in his coat, cold from the outside, and she went to him and took his face in her hands as she sometimes did, claiming the gesture herself, deliberately, and looked at him for a moment in the kitchen warmth. "Happy New Year, husband," she said. "Happy New Year, wife," he said. He pulled her close and held her in the warm kitchen while outside the new decade stood ready, enormous and unwritten. And inside the house their children slept, and the lamp burned, and the creek ran its easy note in the darkness, and the life they had built together held around them like something made to last. It had been made to last. They had built it that way, carefully and honestly and together, starting from 60 acres and a cabin with good bones, starting from a church door opening at exactly the right moment, starting from a woman who turned around. That was how it had been and how it remained. Jennie Lockhart, who became Jennie Keene, who chose late and chose true, and Clarence Keene, who came back when it counted, and the life that grew from that single turning, that single clear-eyed yes, that rang out in the white church on the hill above the Kansas plains like the truest thing either of them had ever said.